It is my honour to work at Monash University and to lead this centre and to continue to advocate for a more just world where human rights are respected, protected and fulfilled, and allowing people to pursue their lives in freedom with dignity. We work on, of course, education, but also in policy and law reform for the benefit of communities around us, and we seek to provide accessible public education on current and important issues. And I'm so pleased to be able to welcome back Julie into the leadership team of the centre. Our team altogether, including all the academics and professional staff, continues to work to deliver outstanding research and meaningful interventions in human rights law in Australia. It has been a very full 12 months for our centre since our last conference. We've made a number of important submissions on anti-vilification laws and changes to state and federal parliamentary regimes. We've been before parliamentary committees and UN bodies. We've worked on issues of judicial ethics, engaged on surrogacy law, and continue to educate the next generation of human rights leaders at the undergraduate, postgraduate and PhD levels. And just recently we were very pleased to be able to contribute to the NGO Coalition report for Australia's upcoming Universal Periodic Review, which will happen around 6 months from now. So I wanted to genuinely welcome each of you who are here in person. It is wonderful to see you. Some I'm seeing again and some seeing for the first time. And welcome to all our distinguished guests again, who I will not read out lists of for fear of getting it wrong. But I also want to welcome the people who are joining us on the live stream. I think there's some 70 people out there in the internet somewhere watching us, so I hope that you're seeing everything clearly. And if you're not, I'm sorry, I just can't deal with it. Speak to Michael upstairs. But I hope it's all going smoothly. Yes, it is, isn't it? Thank you. Your fellow members in the audience today include local, interstate and international attendees from the legal profession, from the human rights sector, from government, from academia, including law students from across Australia. And I'm delighted that you're all here today. And it's so important that we gather together regularly or semi-regularly to re-establish these relationships. So I would ask you today to make sure that you go up to somebody you don't know and introduce yourself and make a new connection with someone, and equally they will do it back with you. You've all seen the program, I think. It looks something like this. This morning we're very pleased to hear from Hugh de Kretser as he delivers our keynote, and we'll follow with a panel discussion with our former director, Professor Sarah Joseph, and talk about how we might achieve stronger human rights protection in Australia, and then we will have a break for morning tea. The time frames are very strict. Someone will say to you in a stern voice, please go back into the auditorium. And then we'll have our second panel on recent challenges in securing rights of trans and gender diverse people, led by my colleague, Professor Paula Gerber. We'll then turn to legal strategies for climate justice, which continue to be the focus of public and legal attention, as it should be. With cases in Australia and international venues decided in the last few days, we have renewed focus on this. And we will have our panel on new challenges in climate change litigation and human rights. And then another short but very enjoyable afternoon tea break. And we'll come back for our final session on understanding human rights law in the coronial jurisdictions. Coronial work has a critical role in justice and in transparency and accountability in public law. And I hope that we'll have the opportunity to discuss the extent that human rights are made explicit and implicit within the coronial context. So I invite you all to engage actively today and encourage people to ensure that conversations are free-flowing, respectful and inclusive. And I hope that we will have time at the end of the sessions for audience questions. There will be student volunteers around to pass you a microphone so people can hear what's being asked. If you're on the if you're asking questions and you're in the auditorium, you won't be seen on the live stream, but your voice will be heard. So if you'd like to ask a question anonymously, just write it on a slip of paper and sort of wave it around, and someone will come and grab the paper and we'll put that through from the chair. And most importantly, if you're here in person, the bathrooms are out that back door and then to the right through the foyer. The evacuation instructions are, don't panic, someone will tell us what to do. And our breaks will happen in the conversation quarter where a few of you were this morning. That's out that way and to the left. and it's a big space, so please make yourself comfortable there. Eat all the food that we've so carefully accounted for by counting every person. And if you have special food requests or needs, please make sure you make that known to the people there. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Hugh de Kretser to deliver his keynote to us. Hugh commenced his 5-year term as President of the Australian Human Rights Commission this time last year, and for more than 2 decades Hugh has been working in critical roles advancing human rights in Australia. Before joining the Commission, Hugh was CEO of the Yoorrook Justice Commission, and previously he worked as the Executive Director of the Human Rights Law Centre. Hugh also asked me not to read out a long bio, so please just Google Hugh and you'll find out all the things that he's done. But please can you join me in welcoming Hugh to the stage. Thank you, Hugh.
Morning everyone. It's fantastic to be here. Flew in last night. I now live in Sydney from January. Melbourne feels like home, and there's so many amazing friendly faces in the audience, people I've worked with for a long time, people I work with now at the Australian Human Rights Commission, so it's great to be here. Keep me in check if I start to feel that sense of smug superiority of now living in Sydney where the weather's better and the city is more beautiful. But what is keeping me in check is my mum. I stayed with mum last night in the house I grew up in, and as I left she was looking at me saying, "You're not wearing enough clothes, you'll be cold, please take a jacket. Are you wearing thermals under your top?" And as I was sitting before, she sent me a text which says, "Hugh, you have left me deeply disturbed about your totally inadequate clothing for this cold Melbourne day. I have so many good-looking warm coats, I'll bet you even probably don't have a fold-up umbrella in your bag. You're forgetting it is Melbourne, cold wind and cold rain." So there you go. The life of the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission. And I acknowledge Gillian Triggs, who's here today, and just big thanks to the people who teach in law schools and inspire people like me to pursue careers in human rights. Gillian taught me international law, and teachers like her and Tim McCormack, there you are, Gillian, absolutely inspired me in my career. You only gave me an H2A on my essay on the Helms-Burton Act, so we need to take that up later. But people like Melissa and Paula Gerber and Julie Debblejack and others, fantastic, inspiring teachers, Sarah Joseph, and thank you for the work you do. And I've been a long admirer of the work of the Castan Centre, and we've worked closely together in previous roles, so it's fantastic to be here. We're on Wurundjeri country. I acknowledge Wurundjeri elders and ancestors and their continuing and ancient and ongoing connection to country and their culture. We talked about, Melissa spoke about Yoorrook. One of the best work days I've ever done in my life was on Wurundjeri country, out in the old Corranderk Mission Reserve, next to what's now Healesville Sanctuary. There's a beautiful clearing there, surrounded by ancient manna gum trees that would have been standing there before Europeans ever walked on this land. Tree ferns, beautiful creek going past it, and it's the place where Wurundjeri elders like Arnie Di Kerr and Arnie Irene Morris have restored the women's and girls' coming of age ceremony. A long tradition that had been broken by colonisation, which they've brought back. And it's the place where, working with Wurundjeri elders, we held a sort of informal hearing with the Premier of Victoria, Jacinta Allen. She sat down with Wurundjeri elders and the girls and women like Mandy Nicholson, and they talked about the importance of culture. The girls talked about how the restoration of culture and participation in that ceremony and their connection to culture had improved their well-being and confidence and identity. And that speaks to the power of restoration of culture, it speaks to the power of truth-telling, and it speaks to the importance of processes like the Yoorrook Justice Commission and that need to be replicated across the country. I want to start by talking about the upcoming UN review of Australia's human rights record. It's called the Universal Periodic Review, and it happens every 5 years at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. The UN Human Rights Council is like the world's human rights parliament, and the UPR, or the Universal Periodic Review, UPR for short, is a peer review process. So each of the I'm going to grab a... I feel like my mum would be saying, have a glass of water. Yeah. So it's a peer review process. So once every 5 years, each nation will have other nations look at their human rights record and then ask questions and make recommendations to those nations. And nations are expected to respond to those recommendations. Last time in 2021, during COVID, all done online, 122 states made around 250 recommendations to Australia. The Australian government supported 177 of the recommendations, and the Human Rights Commission's assessment is that it's fully implemented only 6% of those recommendations, and partly implemented about another 86%. The review is a good time to take stock of Australia's human rights record, where we're at and where we need to get to. The Australian government provides a report outlining progress and regress since the last review, and then the integrity of that process is bolstered by a report from the National Human Rights Institution, in our case the Australian Human Rights Commission, and a report by NGOs. And the NGO coalition, led by the Human Rights Law Centre and others, and endorsed by I think over 150 NGOs, was submitted last week and made public on Monday, and our report was submitted last week and will be on our website shortly. Working with NGOs, we'll brief UN member states on our views on Australia's human rights record and things we need to improve and recommendations they should make to Australia. The review also has input from UN treaty bodies and experts. It's not a perfect process, but it's an important international accountability mechanism, and important for the Australian public to see that scrutiny around our human rights record. So how's Australia doing on human rights? The last time we were reviewed in 2021, we were deep in the COVID pandemic. Australia's responses to the pandemic undeniably saved thousands of lives, and in many respects we outperformed many similar nations around the world. But in some respects, like international travel restrictions or the North Melbourne Towers lockdown, we went too far in limiting people's rights. And the Commission published a report earlier this year on our record in the pandemic around protecting people's human rights. Over the last 5 years, there's been some important progress on other issues. We've had the implementation of the Respect at Work reforms to address sexual harassment and sex discrimination in Australian workplaces. This includes amending the Federal Sex Discrimination Act to have a greater focus on prevention through a positive duty to eliminate unlawful conduct, sexual harassment, sexual discrimination and the like. The Commission is now the national regulator for the positive duty. Got some of the team here today doing fantastic work. We've had the expansion of gender equality reporting to the public sector and the expansion of budgeting processes, making a budget focus on gender equality. We've had the establishment of the new national plan to end violence against women and children. We've had the commissioning or progressing of responses to a range of royal commissions into abuse of people with disability, aged care, robo-debt, responses to the former Institutional Child Sex Abuse Royal Commission and the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide. We've had the establishment of the National Anti-Corruption Commission and the National Administrative Review Tribunal with a stronger focus on systemic reform to stop things like robo-debt. We've had funding given to the Australian Human Rights Commission to set up the National Anti-Racism Framework, which I'll talk about in a sec. We've had progress on some of the closing the gap targets. It's important, closing the gap is often criticised. I think it's very important to recognise where we are succeeding. And with some of those measures are on track, particularly early childhood education, employment and land rights. And Melissa talked about the native title claim in northwestern Victoria. Other measures like Year 12 attainment and tertiary education completion are improving, but not fast enough to meet the targets. Progress on truth-telling we've seen in Victoria, progress on voice in South Australia, and the Victorian Government and First Nations are negotiating a treaty now in Victoria, so there'll be progress there shortly. We've seen the end of temporary protection visas for refugees, and we've seen commitments to address climate change with a legislative goal of reducing emissions by 43% from 2005 levels by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2050, noting that this is not enough to avoid massive impacts from climate change on people's lives here in Australia and globally, and we can talk about the ICJ decision in the panel. The Albanese government has also made election commitments to improve Medicare, housing, access to childcare, as well as to improve higher education by reducing HECS debts and improving accessibility to TAFE. On regress, unfortunately, Australia's gone backwards on many issues. Racism has risen in Australia, linked to the failed Voice referendum and also to the war in the Middle East. Most of the Closing the Gap targets are not on track, and some, like First Nations imprisonment and child removal, are going backwards, and that is a national disgrace. Northern Territory and Queensland in particular are leading a race to the bottom on criminal justice policies. The Northern Territory has just reintroduced unjust mandatory sentencing laws that make it harder for courts to ensure that the punishment fits the crime. Queensland has abolished child rights protections to remove the principle that imprisonment of children should be a last resort. There's been limited progress on raising the age of criminal responsibilities. One of the big focus points of the last UPR was many nations recommended to Australia that the age of criminal responsibility should be raised. Still, most jurisdictions, including the federal jurisdiction, allow children as young as 10. We're talking grade 5 primary school kids to be arrested, prosecuted and locked up. And of course, we know that these are not laws that affect communities equally. It's the First Nations communities who bear the brunt of this. Victoria has raised the age to 12, and the ACT has very recently raised it to 14, with some exceptions. The Northern Territory, however, recently lowered the age from 12 to 10. Queensland also abolished its truth-telling inquiry and its treaty process, and at the national level there's been no progress on truth-telling and treaty. And Australian laws still permit asylum seekers arriving by boat to be turned back without any proper assessment of their refugee claims, and those who do make it to Australia, including children, must be detained and then sent offshore to the tiny island nation of Nauru. So how do we better protect human rights in Australia? Part of the process in the lead up to the UPR, which will happen, Australia's review will be in January next year, is that states are expected to make voluntary commitments, promises about what positive action that they will take to improve human rights protection in Australia. And the NGO Coalition and the Australian Human Rights Commission will be engaging with the Australian government to suggest things that they can do to improve human rights. Australia will also respond to the recommendations made by other nations, choosing which ones to accept and to implement. So what should Australia be doing? That's a big question, and a big part of the answer is in work already done by the Commission, NGOs and others. And either on your seats or at the front desk, there's a booklet which the Commission's produced, which outlines 7 ways that the Australian government should 7 actions that the Australian government should take to better protect human rights in Australia. And this comes from our multi-year Free and Equal project, which was finalised in 2024. Number 1 is to adopt a Human Rights Act for Australia, legislation that protects in Australian law the rights that Australia has promised to protect at the international level. We also need to make our national anti-discrimination laws more effective and comprehensive, and with a much stronger focus on prevention rather than relying on individuals to change unjust systems. We need to establish a national human rights education action plan. We need to improve the parliamentary scrutiny of human rights. We need to support the establishment of a human rights tracker, a way to measure progress and regress on human rights, a bit like the Closing the Gap framework, but for all Australians. We want government to deliver an annual statement to Parliament on its human rights priorities, and we want government to increase support for civil society and the Australian Human Rights Commission to be able to better protect human rights. The Parliament's own Human Rights Committee, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, recently looked at how to better protect human rights in Australia. And in 2024, it recommended establishing a Human Rights Act, drawing heavily on the Commission's model. And and the government hasn't formally responded to that recommendation. It says it's in consideration. The Disability Royal Commission also looked at the Human Rights Commission's free and equal work and adopted much of our work in its own recommendations to improve the Disability Discrimination Act, and we're expecting government to announce consultation around that shortly. Last year, the Commission published the National Anti-Racism Framework. It's an ambitious document that draws on extensive community consultations and research to make 63 recommendations to government and beyond to eliminate racism in this country, and it's needed now more than ever. The priority is getting government buy-in to establish a task force to work through each of the recommendations and to build an implementation plan to get them done. This is just a snapshot of some of the actions that we hope government will commit to. There are so many more things we need to do to better protect people's rights in Australia, from ending deaths in custody, ensuring independent investigation of police misconduct and police-related deaths and other deaths in custody, tackling the dangers of new technologies like AI, neurotech and social media. I want to finish by sharing some reflections on human rights advocacy and some comments on Australian values. As I've got older and my career's got longer, I think I've got better at understanding how positive social change happens in this country. I don't think that the law and policy reform process is taught enough in our schools and university. And for me, it's been a personal journey of understanding. When I started in community law back in 2003, at first it was about helping people to get individual results and win cases. We were making a difference for individual people, but I quickly got sick of doing what felt like band-aid solutions in a system which was unfair for many of the clients we helped. I was lucky to work with amazing advocates like Amanda George, who taught me about law reform, community development and social change, and that became my passion. When I started at the Victorian Federation of Community Legal Centres, I reached out to an experienced and excellent Victorian public servant, Chris Humphreys, for his advice on how I could learn about policy reform and the social change process. And he recommended a book to me, John Kingdon's seminal work on public policy. And the central thesis of this book is about policy windows, moments in the policy cycle where you have an opportunity for change. Kingdon says that a policy window opens when three things align. The problem is well understood by government, experts and the broader community. The solution is available and feasible, and the political will is there. For people advocating for human rights reforms, the message for us is collectively we need to do our policy work. We need to be credible and trusted. We need to have the right relationships, and then we need to be ready to move quickly when a policy window opens. And I think I look at the human rights sector as a whole there, because I think different organisations can play different roles in those objectives. Often policy windows will open unpredictably and quickly, and often they'll close very fast. I remember at the last UPR cycle, when I was at the Human Rights Law Centre, looking at what voluntary commitments that might align with what the Morrison government might want to achieve. And I thought the implementation of the Commission's Respect at Work recommendations around eliminating sexual harassment in this country was a good fit, and advocated for them to make voluntary commitments around that. And we didn't get any traction whatsoever. Then there was the international and domestic focus on women's rights brought about by the Me Too movement, the Women's Marches for Justice and the powerful advocacy by Brittany Higgins and others. This raised the public and political awareness of the problem and made political will happen. The Commission's recommendations meant that there was a ready-made solution available and feasible, and the relationships were there to enable them to be implemented. The policy window opened and government quickly committed to the Respect at Work reforms and a range of other positive reforms. And across both the Morrison and Albanese governments, all of those reforms have now been implemented. So many human rights changes happen this way. Years, and sometimes decades of hard strategic advocacy, campaigning and legal action are often involved. Often there's inches forward and inches back. Sometimes we're just trying to hold the line to stop bad things from happening and then waiting for that moment where the window opens and then you can move and the change can be won. working as a commissioner at the Victorian Law Reform Commission back in 2008 to 2012. Also taught me the importance of understanding the perspectives of all the different interest groups contributing to different policy reform processes. If we want government or business to take up a reform, we need to understand the perspectives of those who might oppose some or all of that reform that we're proposing. If we don't agree with their perspectives, we need to be able to explain to government why they should prefer our approach. We also need to look for compromise, common ground, and consensus to make it easier for government to implement reforms. Maybe in the panel we can talk about why the Human Rights Act hasn't been accepted now, and look at some of the interest groups who have opposed that and why we need to engage with those groups. I was at Uruk when Uruk Justice Commission when the Voice referendum happened. And it was heartbreaking turning up to work the next day after that no vote and seeing advocates like Annie Eleanor Burke, the chair of the commission, who had spent her life advocating for First Nations rights. And I was devastated for her and First Nations colleagues, and in her very wise way, she said to me, Hugh, these things are beyond our control. And it was a way that helped me to process the disappointment of that loss. And that's not personal for me, I'm not First Nation, so the disappointment for her and her communities and First Nations communities across the country. And I was lucky to have a job to address the reasons why the Voice referendum failed. And for me, it provided a sense of purpose and energy. And I looked at the survey research around why people voted a certain way, yes or no. And one of the questions that was asked by survey research done by Sydney Morning Herald and The Age was, do you think colonisation has been good, bad or mixed or unsure for First Nations people? Working at Uruk, with all the devastation we had seen in terms of the massacres, the land theft, the suppression of culture, the suppression of language, the removal of children, mass imprisonment, ongoing child removal, the answer to that question is obvious. But when I looked at those results, it showed that twice as many people thought that twice as many Australian people in this demographically represented sample thought that colonisation had been good for First Peoples, about 40%, and about 20% said they thought it had been bad, and about 40% were in that mixed or unsure category. And that moment for me was a realisation that all the time that we had spent crafting the best informed policy solutions to fix over-imprisonment or to fix bail laws or to fix land justice or the education system, those recommendations will not have, I was going to say will not go anywhere. They still have a chance of success, but that chance is massively diminished if the Australian public does not understand the reason why we need those reforms in the first place. And for me, the Voice referendum, that one question and the answer to that question helped to explain why, in John Kingdon's terms, the problem wasn't well understood enough by the public. This is why truth-telling is so important, and if you haven't read particularly the final report of the Uruk Justice Commission, it's reports that have recommendations in it. I hesitate to say this, but I'd say the most important thing for people to read is the Truth Be Told report, which is a masterpiece. It's written by a First Nations writer, Daniel James, Yorta Yorta, descendant of Lance James, who was the teacher at the Yorta Mission, Maloga Mission, and it is incredible. It's history told from the First Nations perspective. It's the history of Victoria told through First Nations eyes, and it's extremely powerful, and my hope is that it helps to bring about that understanding that then enables change. And if you prefer TV, Bridget Brennan's Four Corners episode on Uruk is still available on iView, and it's fantastic. I want to give you some good news and hope. And when I looked at those results after the referendum, I looked at what understanding there is in Australia of injustice against First Peoples, to try and take an evidence-based approach to where we focused our attention. And there is really good understanding of the injustice of the stolen generations. Why? Because of generations of advocacy by survivors, their families, communities, and the organisations that represent them. Why? Because of the 1997 Bringing Them Home report by the Australian Human Rights Commission, which documented their experiences and made recommendations for reform. And my predecessor, Rosalind Croucher, would talk about this report in terms of the long arc of justice and the long arc of the implementation of some recommendations from bodies like ours. The Howard government rejected the Bringing Them Home report, but fast forward to 2008, and that report led and contributed to Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's apology to the stolen generations in Parliament. I was standing down in Fed Square when he made that apology. A fantastic day. And then you can fast forward from 2008 to the establishment of redress schemes, compensation schemes for stolen generation survivors. Now, with Western Australia just announcing their scheme, established in every jurisdiction except for Queensland, including by the Morrison government in 2022 with the federal or the territory scheme. And it speaks to the fact that no political party has a monopoly on human rights. It was the Whitlam and then the Fraser governments which signed and ratified the two major human rights treaties. The Human Rights Commission was established by the Fraser government and then made permanent by the Hawke government. The Howard government, which rejected the Bringing Them Home report and regressed on human rights in a number of ways, also led landmark gun law reforms, which have made our communities safer and reduced the number of deaths from shootings. The Rudd government, which delivered the apology and set up our first national human rights framework, was also the government which 12 years ago this month set up that policy where they said no one arriving by boat who is a refugee will ever be allowed to settle in Australia. I want to end by talking about human rights and Australian values, and I hope we can continue that discussion in the panel. And Gillian, thanks for doing your work. I was looking at research on this, and I didn't realise the Commission has done a paper on 100 years of Anzacs, and I was surprised to see it there and really grateful that that work was done, and I've drawn on this work in looking at Australian values. What is it that unites us as Australians? How do we define what we stand for as a nation? At Federation in 1901, Australian identity was closely linked to Britain. Racist laws and policies sought to keep Australia for the white man. The drafters of our Constitution deliberately rejected including equal rights guarantees, not wanting to give them to First Nations or non-white people. We ended up with a minimalistic constitution with very limited express human rights guarantees. On some human rights issues like workers' rights and democratic reforms, Australia has led the world, including introducing the 8-hour day, the secret ballot, women's voting rights, and preferential voting. Prime Minister Billy Hughes told a British audience in 1916 that Australia was the most democratic government in the world, conveniently ignoring the disenfranchisement of First Nations peoples. During World War II, the language of rights emerged more strongly. Australia was an original signatory to the 1942 United Nations Declaration, which sought to define what the Allies were fighting for. The signatories declared, "Complete victory is essential to defend life, liberty, independence and religious freedom, and to preserve human rights and justice in their own lands as well as other lands." Australia was a leading force in the drafting the 1945 UN Charter and the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Australia's Doc Evatt and Jessie Street pushed for stronger human rights guarantees, including an international court to enforce the rights in the Declaration. Successive Australian governments signed and ratified all the major human rights treaties. Fast forward to 2007, and it was John Howard's government which introduced the controversial citizenship test in a bid to build social cohesion around a perceived ideal of what it is to be Australian. The subsequent Labor government initiated review of the test, said it was flawed, intimidating to some and discriminatory, and it was revised, but it was kept. And it's not talked about much these days, but I like reading it. What does it say about what makes us Australian? How do we define what it is to be Australian. And the booklet says, Australians believe in shared values such as the dignity and freedom of each person, equal opportunity for men and women, and the rule of law. Australian citizenship is about living these values in everyday life. It goes on to describe other core values including freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of religion. And when migrants become citizens, they must make a pledge saying, I pledge my loyalty to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I respect, and whose laws I will uphold and obey. And the Prime Minister Albanese, in his election night speech in May, drew on similar themes when he said, so let us all work together to build our national unity on the enduring foundations of fairness, equality, and respect for one another. So it seems to me that human rights values are at the heart of what we say it means to be Australian. The problem is we're not properly living up to these values. While Australia supported the Universal Declaration and promised to protect the human rights set out in all those major human rights treaties that followed it, Australian people can't enforce those rights directly in Australian courts if their rights are breached. Our human rights protections are patchy and our human rights safety net has holes in it. An Australian Human Rights Act would help to address this. For me, it would be like a reverse citizenship test where Australian governments and parliaments legally promise to protect the human rights of all people in Australia. It would foster understanding and civic education by listing, I must be getting old if I'm mentioning civics education. It would foster understanding and civics education by listing in one place, protected by law, the human rights that all Australians should enjoy. An Australian Human Rights Act would help to build a culture of preventing human rights breaches. But so those human rights are taken seriously, it's critical to give people the power to take action if their rights are breached. We've already got human rights acts operating effectively in the ACT, Victoria and Queensland, applying to their respective state and territory governments. And there's so many examples of the differences, big and small that these acts have made to people's lives. Stopping families from being evicted into homelessness, securing dignity and equality for people with disabilities, helping women fleeing family violence, and much more. Across the country, survey work commissioned by Amnesty and the Human Rights Law Centre has shown that support for the National Human Rights Act is strong. It grew under COVID when there was a deeper understanding of the lack of protection for human rights in this country. There's a good community campaign for a Human Rights Act with over 100 diverse organisations, First Nations, disability, faith-based agencies and more, all backing the call for a Human Rights Act. And we've had the recommendation from the Parliament's own Human Rights Committee for a Human Rights Act. An Australian Human Rights Act would translate our values into legal protections to improve people's lives. It would help make our society fairer for all, and it's time it happened. Thank you.